Hey, everybody. I wanted to give a preview for this Sunday's Sunday school class. We are on chapter 4 of Chris Wright's book, Here Are Your Gods. And this chapter is entitled Mission and the Gods. And so it's going to be looking at our response or how we deal with the gods in the many different uh, places and contexts that we find ourselves. There's social context, cultural, evangelistic settings, and pastoral settings. So let's just kind of look at where he goes with this chapter. The first thing he notes is that there are sort of two aspects he wants to give attention to. The first is remembering that the battle is the Lord's. It's not our battle. We're not fighting on for God's sake, but God is fighting this battle, and He calls us into that battle in which He is waging, and so we are co-participants in the mission of God, rather than it being our mission, and God is just sitting by, watching and waiting, and even hoping that we might win. The next thing that he goes on in the second chapter then is to look at some of the varied contexts in which we confront idolatry, especially looking at the scriptures in the New Testament, especially in looking at how the Apostle Paul approached this question, and from what we can gather. And so we'll look at that here in just a moment. First of all, though, is the most important thing is that remembering that the battle is the Lord's and not our battle. Exodus 12:12 tells us that God is speaking to Moses here. He says, "For I will pass through the land of Egypt that night, and I will strike all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And on all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord." Here we see the story of Exodus, and if you were with us when we preached through Exodus a couple years ago, we gave special attention to the fact that God was in fact waging war against the pantheon of Egypt, and that's also true for His entire mission of redemption. That mankind in his fallen condition is a manufacturer of idols and gods, and God's mission of redemption is to rid that from all of humanity. So the three kind of ways he wants to look at this is looking at it from the perspective of the missional love of God to repel idolatry, the battle and victory belonging to God, and that the battle is fought with love and not triumphalism. First thing he does in this section is that he notes that as this is a part of God's mission, it is also a part of God's redemptive purposes, and so needs to be understood within the context of God's redemptive love for His creation. A divine jealousy is an essential function of divine love. We often might think of wrath and hate as, or of wrath and love as opposites, but rather the jealousy and the wrath and the anger of God is raised because He is a God of love, and that His love is only turns to jealous wrath when it is spurned and rejected. And so part of His redemption is to bring people back into that sphere of His wondrous love. The Bible is the story of God's persistent determination to defeat all that might seek to turn us away from God's love. And God's mission is the blessing of the nations, and a blessing that includes ridding the nations of false gods. And so even in this language of contention and fight and battle and so forth, we also see it in the context of God's love. And that's an important point for us to keep in mind. First of all, our battle is fought with love and not triumphalism. So only the gospel can unmask the false claims of the gods, and the gospel of God's redemptive love for us in Jesus Christ, in His work on the cross, in the suffering of the Son is an expression of God's redemptive love, and it is one in which, as we participate in this mission, we follow that same pattern and model. We join in God's battle as we are moved to or by a deep compassion for those who are oppressed by false gods. The mission of the gospel, the mission of the church, is a mission of liberation, of bringing freedom, bringing relief, bringing people out of the bondage of sin that is such a powerful force in people's lives. We participate in God's mission, reflecting God's own love and desire to be a blessing to the nations. And so we also see the work that we are participating in with God as one in which we are seeking to reflect God's own love for his creation as well. The second portion of this chapter is confronting idolatry in varied contexts. And so combating idolatry takes many forms that require different approaches in varied contexts. And the Bible illustrates the role of wisdom and discernment in this fight. And so we're going to look at 4 different areas. The first is defining idolatry in theological argument. The second is challenging idolatry in evangelistic engagement. The next is explaining idolatry for pastoral guidance. And finally, exposing idolatry with prophetic warning. So defining idolatry in theological argument, our key text is Romans 1:18-32, which is Paul's classic exposition of pagan idolatry and the ruinous effects of turning from God to the creature. And it's here Paul presents this robust exposition of idolatry as an objective phenomenon. It's really there, and it's something that needs to be understood. And so Paul here is teaching in a way that helps the believers to understand the true nature of what we are dealing with. And also to remember that this exposition of idolatry in Romans isn't just a standalone explanation. It is sort of the foundation for moving to the gospel. The gospel is good news, of course. And so having the theological grounding of explaining the ruinous effects and the tragedy of idolatry is sort of the foundation for taking that next step from the bad news into the good news. Another thing to keep in mind is that Paul is writing to Christians, and this is a part of his teaching ministry in the church, and he is warning Christians about these things. And so we need to understand, the point here is that we need to understand the full truth and vacuousness of what idolatry is and what it does. And once we can understand that, then we can stand upon that foundation in other situations and contexts. The second thing that we'll look at here is challenging idolatry within an evangelistic engagement. And here, Wright looks at Paul in the book of Acts in 3 different locations where Paul confronts pagan idolatry. And so what we see in these texts is that while not compromising his theological foundation, which we saw in Romans 1, Paul adjusts his tone to speak the truth with grace and respect. We see common themes in Paul's evangelistic engagement with idolaters in Lystra and Athens. And so you have these 3 passages. You have Acts 14, he's in Lystra. Acts 17, he's in Athens. And Acts 19, he's in Ephesus. In Lystra and Athens, we see that Paul touches some similar themes. He recognizes, or he acknowledges, that God is the creator of all things. He communicates that God has been good and kind to all, and that God longs for people to seek him. And that he noticed, and Paul also then notes God has been patient with the ignorance of idolaters in the past. But then also, Paul is definitive in calling for a decisive turning away from idols, a call to repentance, away from the idols and toward the living God. In Ephesus, in Acts 19, we also see that Paul it's an example of Paul adjusting his tone. Paul clearly calls the idols handmade and that they are not gods at all. But at the same time, Paul was recognized by secular officials as being neither sacrilegious nor blasphemous of their gods. And this could only happen if Paul is exercising the restraint that is needed, that is motivated and prompted by love for the other people, a desire to be clear in his communication with them, a desire for them to want to hear and want to receive the message that he has given them. So he comes across to them as someone who is reasonable. And Paul can adjust. The point here is that Paul can adjust his tone without compromising biblical truth. And that's an important lesson for us as we speak to one another, or as we speak to those who aren't Christians about the dangers of idolatry and about the gospel and the sin that's in their lives. People don't necessarily need the theological treatise of Romans 1. We need it to stand upon it, but we also need to be able to communicate those truths in a way that's going to be received. The other thing is that we see in the New Testament here is explaining idolatry for the purpose of pastoral guidance. And the classic text here is 1 Corinthians chapters 8, 9, and 10, where Paul deals with food offered to idols. Paul guides the Corinthians to make a distinction between participation in idolatrous practice from the very fact that you have to live within the world of paganism. And so he calls that ambient idolatry. It's inescapable. You can't fully remove yourself from it, but you have to learn how to live within it without compromising and participating fully in its practices. So the question of meat offered to idols is an example of this. And what Paul teaches us in the Corinthians is that Christians may purchase meat from the marketplace, even though it has been a part of a pagan offering. That itself shouldn't be a game changer. It shouldn't sort of close the deal. It is, if the gods are nothing, and we know they are nothing, then what somebody else did with it beforehand really should not be that big of a deal for us. Now, at the same time, Paul also urges Christians to exercise really the law of love. Not everyone is going to have their conscience as oriented in the same way. And then some Christians will be stronger and more mature, and others, new believers, especially those who may be troubled, they need to be dealt with carefully and tenderly. And so, so we don't cause others to stumble. And that's an important thing here. Finally, is that Christians, though, must not participate in pagan practices. And here he has the difference between buying meat in the market but then being invited to someone's house or invited to the temple itself to participate in a festal meal. That's a no-no, because then by our presence we're giving sort of a sense of agreement with what's going on. Finally, we look at Paul in Ephesians 4, and we can also go back to the Old Testament, where we see that another way of dealing with idolatry in our various contexts is that of prophetic warning. And the key passage here is Jeremiah 10, but then also Ephesians 4. The Bible condemns the false gods most often as a warning to God's people. Interestingly, when we look at the Old Testament prophets and when they condemn the worship practices of the other nations, it's typically it's typically condemned as they are speaking to Israel. When they speak out and write out as a communication to these other nations, their condemnation is almost always the wicked practices that they do. And so the attention to idolatry is sort of understood as a warning against the people of God. Paul, for example, does this in Ephesians 4, where Paul reminds the Ephesians of the darkness and ignorance from which the gospel has freed them. And he does so as a way to warn them not to go back, not to be enticed to return back to those practices or find strength in them. And so it's a warning of the dangers of idolatry. And that's all we need. And that's the end of our uh, PowerPoint here. So I look forward to seeing you on Sunday, and we will talk to you later.